Please take a deep breath and close your eyes for just a moment. Try to remember the fading light of a late afternoon when you were a child. Can you hear the distinct, rhythmic clacking of wooden sandals on the pavement? Or perhaps the mournful, sweet chime of the tofu vendor echoing down your narrow street? If these sounds bring a sudden warmth to your chest, then you know exactly what time we are returning to today. Today, we are traveling back to the Japan of the 1960s, 70s, and 1980s. We are going to explore 20 deeply beautiful, everyday rituals that have quietly slipped away from our modern lives. These were the small, seemingly insignificant acts that filled our childhoods with texture, scent, and meaning. And please stay with me until the very end, because the last ritual we will talk about is a heartbreakingly beautiful way we used to say goodbye, a gesture of love that modern technology has completely erased. Before we begin our journey, let us remember how time used to feel back then. Time moved slower, did it not? It was a heavier, more deliberate kind of time. We did not have smartphones in our pockets demanding our constant attention, nor did we have the convenience of instant gratification. Everything required a little bit of waiting, a little bit of physical effort, and a great deal of patience. But this waiting was not a burden. It was the space where life actually happened. We stood in lines, we walked to local shops, we waited for the mail, and in those moments of waiting, we talked to each other. We knew our neighbors' faces, the sound of their voices, and the specific rhythms of our local streets. There is a modern myth that life before the internet was somehow smaller or poorer. But as we look back at these decades, we realize the absolute opposite is true. Life was incredibly rich in sincerity, bound tightly together by shared daily rituals. We may have had fewer things, but the things we had were handled with care. The human connections we made were deliberate, deeply felt, and undeniably real. Now, let us walk down those familiar old streets once again. Let us begin with a sound that defined the late afternoons of our childhoods. Do you remember the distinct, mournful, yet comforting sound of the small brass horn echoing down your street? It was the tofu vendor, pedaling slowly on his heavy bicycle. In those days, buying tofu was not a quick, mindless trip to the sterile aisles of a brightly lit supermarket. It was a daily ritual, a moment of true neighborhood connection. You would hear that familiar melodic sound, grab a ceramic bowl or a small pot from your mother's kitchen, and run out the front door. The vendor would carefully open his wooden box, and the faint, sweet scent of fresh soybeans and cool, clean water would hit the air. He would expertly slice the delicate block of tofu in the palm of his hand, letting it slide perfectly into your bowl. There was always a gentle exchange of coins, perhaps a brief conversation about the weather, or a polite inquiry about your family's health. The coins felt heavy and significant in your small hands. Carrying that water-filled bowl back inside required your utmost concentration, making sure not to spill a single drop on the dusty road. It was a simple task, but it made you feel incredibly important, woven into the daily fabric of your neighborhood. That freshly made tofu, eaten later that evening at the family table, tasted of community and care. As the seasons changed and the freezing evenings of winter arrived, another familiar song would drift through the frosty air. Can you still hear that melancholic, drawn-out voice calling out in the dark? It was the sweet potato vendor, slowly driving his small truck through the residential streets. When you heard that voice, a sudden rush of warmth would fill your chest. You would beg your parents for a few coins, wrap yourself in your thickest coat, and dash out into the biting cold night. The truck was a beacon of light and heat, emitting thick plumes of fragrant, sweet wood smoke. The vendor, usually an older man with a warm smile and a thick scarf wrapped around his neck, would open the heavy iron oven door. Inside, resting on a bed of dark, scorching hot pebbles, were the most perfect sweet potatoes. He would weigh them on a small manual scale and wrap them in rough, brown paper or old newspaper. the intense heat would immediately transfer to your freezing, bare hands, offering instant comfort. Breaking that potato in half was a sensory masterpiece. The skin would tear with a soft crackle, revealing the glowing golden interior that steamed beautifully in the winter night. Standing there by the side of the road, blowing on the hot potato and taking that first sweet bite, you felt a deep sense of happiness that no expensive modern dessert could ever replicate. Let us take a trip to the train station, long before the era of plastic cards and digital turnstiles. Traveling anywhere meant holding a piece of thick, stiff cardboard in your hand. But the true magic of this ritual was the station attendant standing inside his small wooden booth at the ticket gate. As the rush hour crowds flowed past him, he would perform a mesmerizing, rhythmic dance. With a heavy metal puncher in his hand, he would rapidly stamp every single ticket that passed by. The sound was incredibly fast and precise, a constant mechanical clicking that echoed through the entire station. He did not even need to look at his hands. He would smile, nod, and effortlessly punch a tiny, perfectly shaped notch into the edge of your ticket. Handing your ticket to him was an act of physical connection between traveler and railway. You would keep that punched ticket in your pocket throughout your journey, feeling its rough edges. Sometimes children would collect the used tickets, marveling at the different shapes of the notches from various stations. It was a physical receipt of your journey, a tiny cardboard memory. Today, we simply tap our phones on a piece of glass and walk through in silence, completely missing the human rhythm that used to welcome us onto the platform. After school, the absolute center of the universe for any child was the local neighborhood candy store. Stepping into that cramped, dimly lit shop was like entering a treasure chest. The air smelled of old wood, sugar, and the dust dancing in the afternoon sun rays. The shop was always run by an elderly woman or man, sitting quietly in the back on a worn cushion. Every available surface was covered with large glass jars and open cardboard boxes filled with brightly colored candies, dried squid, and small cheap toys. The greatest joy was holding a few small coins in your sweaty palm and calculating exactly how many different sweets you could afford. You would pick out a piece of chewing gum that came with a tiny lottery ticket, hoping desperately to win a second piece. You would buy the vibrant, almost neon-colored powdered juices that left your tongue stained red or green for the rest of the day. There was no rush. The shop owner would patiently wait as you changed your mind 3 or 4 times, eventually helping you count your coins on the worn wooden counter. This small shop was our first lesson in managing money, in making choices, and in interacting with adults outside our families. It was a chaotic, beautiful sanctuary, built entirely for the joy of children. When summer vacation finally arrived, our mornings were defined by a ritual that required immense discipline. Long before the terrible summer heat set in, while the grass in the local park was still wet with morning dew, children across the neighborhood would gather. We all wore our summer clothes, sleepy-eyed and yawning, holding a small cardboard attendance card on a string around our necks. At exactly 6:30 in the morning, the local radio would be turned on, and the bright, cheerful piano music of the National Radio Calisthenics would begin. A local volunteer, often a neighborhood father or grandfather, would stand at the front and lead the exercises. We would stretch our arms, bend our knees, and breathe in the fresh morning air in perfect unison with thousands of other people across the country doing the exact same thing at the exact same time. The true prize, however, came at the end. We would line up and the volunteer would take a small rubber stamp and press it onto our cards. Filling that card with bright red stamps over the 40 days of summer was a badge of absolute honor. It taught us routine, community, and the simple beauty of sharing the very first moments of the day with our neighbors under the early summer sun. Another quiet morning ritual happened right at our front doors, often before we were even awake. Attached to the wall beside the entrance was a small, wooden or plastic box. In the earliest hours of the morning, while it was still dark, the milk delivery man would arrive. You could hear the faint, musical clinking of glass bottles as he walked up the path. He would take out the empty bottles from the day before and replace them with fresh ones. When you woke up and opened the lid of that box, the smell of the damp wood and the sight of the cold glass bottles felt like a quiet blessing. The milk was capped with a thick paper lid and securely wrapped in a thin plastic film. Opening it required a special little tool, a tiny pick to pierce the paper and pry it off. If you were lucky, a thick, rich layer of cream had settled at the very top of the bottle. Drinking that milk, feeling the cold, heavy glass against your lips, was the purest way to start the morning. There was an unspoken trust in this ritual. We washed the empty bottles and left them out, knowing they would be collected, cleaned, and returned. It was a gentle cycle of care that connected our kitchen tables to the dairy farms, all delivered in beautiful glass that never ended up in the trash. Let us move into the hallway of the house where the family telephone lived. It was not a personal device tucked into a pocket. It was a heavy, imposing object made of black bakelite, sitting proudly on a small table. Often, to protect it from dust, mothers would drape a beautifully intricate, handmade lace cover over the receiver. Making a phone call was a very deliberate, physical act. You had to place your finger in the hole of the heavy rotary dial, pull it all the way to the metal stopper, and let it go. It would spin back with a deeply satisfying, mechanical whirring sound. You had to memorize the phone numbers of your friends and family, holding those digits perfectly in your mind. And because the phone was in the hallway, there was absolutely no privacy. When you called a friend, you always risked their strict father answering the phone, forcing you to use your most polite, trembling voice to ask if your friend was home. If you were a teenager talking to your crush, your entire family could hear your half of the conversation from the living room. We were tethered to the wall by a coiled cord, pacing back and forth within a 3-foot radius. It made every phone call an event, something planned and respected, rather than a casual, fleeting text message. When evening fell, the center of domestic life was the low, round wooden table in the living room. We did not sit on high chairs at isolated kitchen islands. We sat on the floor, on flat cushions placed over the woven tatami mats. The entire family gathered intimately around this one small table. It was where we ate our dinners, where we did our homework, and where mothers folded the laundry. Because the table was small, our knees would often touch under the surface. We were physically close to one another, sharing the dishes placed in the center. In the corner of the room sat the heavy wooden television set. Watching television was a collective family activity. There was no pausing, no rewinding, and certainly no individual screens. We all watched the same evening variety show or the same baseball game, laughing together and commenting on the broadcast. The smell of soy sauce, grilled fish, and steamed rice would fill the room, mixing with the earthy scent of the tatami. When the night was over, the table was wiped clean, its legs were folded underneath, and it was pushed against the wall so the heavy sleeping mattresses could be laid out in the exact same space. The room transformed seamlessly, mirroring the flexible, deeply connected nature of family life. Not every house in those days had a private bath, which meant the daily bathing ritual took place at the local public bathhouse. Walking there in the early evening, carrying a small plastic basin filled with your soap, shampoo, and a thin cotton towel was a cherished routine. You would push through the split curtain at the entrance, take off your shoes, and place them in a wooden locker with a large, numbered wooden key. Inside, the bathing area was vast, echoing loudly with the sounds of splashing water, scrubbing brushes, and the lively chatter of neighbors. One wall was almost always decorated with a magnificent, sweeping painting of Mount Fuji. The water in the deep tiled tubs was notoriously, wonderfully hot. You would sit on a small wooden stool, scrub yourself clean, and finally sink into the steaming water, letting out a deep sigh of relief alongside the older men and women of the neighborhood. But the most important part of the ritual came after stepping out. You would dry off, put your clothes back on, and buy a cold glass bottle of fruit milk or coffee milk from the glowing refrigerator. It was an unwritten rule that you had to drink it while standing, with one hand placed firmly on your hip, tilting your head back. It was the perfect, sweet conclusion to a day shared with your community. During the bitterly cold days of winter, the kitchen became a place of quiet endurance and care. Preparing the evening meal involved a ritual that tested the resilience of every mother and grandmother. Before electric rice cookers handled everything with the push of a button, washing the rice was a deeply physical task. You would measure the dry, white grains into a heavy bowl and turn on the tap. In the dead of winter, that water was freezing, so cold it felt like small needles against the skin. Yet, bare hands would plunge into the icy water, swirling the rice in rapid, circular motions. The sound was distinct, a rhythmic, scratching noise as the grains rubbed against each other, releasing their milky starch. The water had to be drained and refilled multiple times until it ran perfectly clear. We watched our mothers do this, their hands turning bright red and numb from the cold, yet they never rushed the process. They taught us that washing the rice properly was the only way to honor the farmers and ensure the meal tasted perfect. When we finally sat down to eat the steaming, glossy white rice, we were tasting not just the food, but the silent, freezing effort of the hands that prepared it for us with so much love. As the year drew to a close, a beautiful burden fell upon the household. It was time to prepare the New Year greeting cards. In the weeks leading up to December, the dining table would be cleared of everything else and transformed into a writing studio. We did not send quick digital messages to thousands of people. We bought blank postcards and spent hours, sometimes days, crafting them by hand. The smell of the dark, rich ink pad filled the room. Children would carefully carve the shape of the upcoming zodiac animal into half a potato or a soft piece of rubber to create custom stamps. Then came the writing. Every single address and every single name was written out by hand using a fine brush or a good pen. We wrote to old teachers, distant relatives, and friends we had not seen in years, carefully considering our relationship with each person as we formed the characters of their name. The goal was to drop the massive stack of cards into the mailbox before the deadline, ensuring they would arrive exactly on the morning of January 1st. Waking up on New Year's Day and hearing the thud of the thick bundle of cards dropping into our mailbox, held tightly together by a single rubber band, was a moment of immense joy. Reading through those handwritten messages was a physical proof that you were remembered and loved. For a child in the 1970s, the absolute peak of weekend excitement was a Sunday trip to the massive department store in the city. But the true destination was not the clothing floors or the basement food markets. The magic happened on the very roof of the building. The rooftops of these grand stores were transformed into small, vibrant amusement parks. Stepping out of the elevator into the bright sunlight, you were greeted by the sound of cheerful mechanical music and the sight of colorful balloons swaying in the wind. There were small, coin-operated rides shaped like pandas, trains, and spaceships. You would beg your parents for a 10-yen coin, climb onto the hard plastic seat, and rock back and forth for 3 minutes of pure bliss. Afterwards, the family would go to the enormous dining hall on the top floor. The entrance windows displayed perfect, shining plastic models of the food. The ultimate treat was ordering the special Children-us meal. It arrived on a plate shaped like a bullet train, featuring a small mound of rice with a tiny, colorful flag proudly stuck right in the center. Eating that meal, high above the busy city streets, made you feel like you were the most special person in the entire world. When the humid, oppressive heat of summer finally settled over the islands, it brought with it the relentless hum of mosquitoes. But instead of spraying harsh, invisible chemicals, we fought them with a ritual that engaged all our senses. Out came the heavy ceramic mosquito coil holder, always shaped like a round, adorable pig with a carrying handle on top. We would take a fragile, dark green spiral of mosquito incense, gently separate it from its partner, and place it inside the pig. Striking the match and lighting the very tip of the coil was a job usually given to the older children. A tiny red ember would glow, and immediately a thin ribbon of pale blue smoke would curl up into the air. The smell of that smoke is the absolute essence of a Japanese summer. It was deep, earthy, slightly sharp, and deeply comforting. The ceramic pig would sit on the edge of the wooden porch. As the evening darkened and the deafening chorus of cicadas began to fade, we would watch the ash of the coil grow incredibly long before finally breaking and falling to the bottom. That scent drifting through the open sliding doors meant that summer was here and that we were safe and protected while we slept. In contrast to the summer, winter survival revolved entirely around a single piece of furniture. When the temperatures dropped, the heavy, heated table called the kotatsu was brought into the center of the living room. It was a low wooden frame with an electric heater attached underneath, covered by a thick, incredibly heavy quilted blanket with a solid tabletop placed over it. The moment you slid your freezing legs under that blanket, you were instantly trapped in a paradise of warmth. The whole family would sit around it, our feet often bumping into each other in the dark, heated space below. The most essential companion to this heated table was a massive bowl of brightly colored mandarin oranges. We would sit for hours watching the evening comedy shows, mindlessly peeling the cold, sweet oranges. The contrast between the freezing air on our shoulders and the intense heat on our legs was oddly perfect. The greatest danger, of course, was falling deeply asleep under the heavy blanket, mesmerized by the warmth. Waking up hours later, sweaty, dehydrated, with your mother scolding you to go sleep in your proper bed, is a universal memory of winter comfort that we all secretly miss. Taking care of the traditional house required constant physical maintenance, and one of the most vivid memories is the polishing of the wooden corridors. These polished wooden hallways wrapped around the outside of the rooms, connecting the inside of the house to the garden. Keeping them beautiful was a serious chore. We would take old, damp curtains rags and get down on our hands and knees. We would push the rags back and forth along the grain of the wood, racing from one end of the corridor to the other. The wood was old, smooth, and deeply darkened by years of foot traffic and wax. The smell of the floor wax mixed with the damp scent of the garden dirt was intoxicating. But this corridor was not just a hallway, it was the border between our home and nature. After the chores were done, it became the best seat in the house. During the heavy summer rains, we would sit on the very edge of the polished wood, dangling our feet, watching the water pour off the roof tiles and splash into the mud. We would eat slices of cold watermelon, spitting the black seeds directly into the bushes. That wooden corridor was our private theater for watching the seasons change. For teenagers in the 1980s, music was not something you could simply stream from a cloud. Music was something physical, something you had to patiently hunt for and carefully capture onto a plastic rectangle. The cassette tape was our most prized possession. We would sit on the tatami floor, huddled close to the large stereo radio, waiting for the weekly countdown show to play our favorite idol US new song. The tension was immense. You had to hover your fingers over the record and play buttons, ready to press them both down at the exact second the song started, while praying the radio host would stop talking over the intro. When making a mixed tape for a friend or a crush, you had to calculate the minutes perfectly so a song would not cut off abruptly at the end of side A. Sometimes the delicate brown magnetic tape would get caught and tangled in the machine, and we would have to perform emergency surgery using a wooden pencil to slowly, carefully wind the tape back into the cassette. The slight hiss of the tape before the music started, the clunky sound of the plastic buttons, and the handwritten track lists on the paper covers made every single song feel earned and deeply personal. On perfectly clear, sunny weekends, the neighborhoods would transform visually and acoustically. It was the day to sun-dry the heavy cotton sleeping mattresses. Mothers would carry the heavy, thick bedding out onto the second-floor balconies, draping them beautifully over the railings so they could soak up the bright sunlight. Then came the sound that defined a sunny Japanese morning. Using a special woven bamboo stick, they would rhythmically beat the hanging mattresses to knock out the dust and fluff the heavy cotton fibers. The sharp, echoing thwack, thwack, thwack sound would bounce from house to house, a cheerful symphony of domestic labor. Walking down the street, you would look up and see a colorful patchwork of blankets hanging from every single house. Later in the afternoon, when you helped carry the mattresses back inside, they felt incredibly light, warm to the touch, and puffed up to twice their size. When you finally went to sleep that night, burying your face into the pillows, you could actually smell the sunshine trapped inside the cotton. It was a crisp, warm, incredibly clean scent that guaranteed the deepest, most peaceful sleep imaginable. As the changing of the seasons approached, the fragile paper doors that separated our rooms needed to be renewed. Replacing the paper on the wooden sliding screens was an annual family event that required delicacy and patience. Over the year, the white paper would turn slightly yellow, and inevitably, a child would have poked a tiny, secret hole through it with a curious finger. The ritual began by carrying the tall wooden frames outside. We would use a damp sponge to wet the old glue, carefully peeling away the old paper in long, satisfying strips. The wooden grid was washed clean and left to dry in the wind. Then, the mother would bring out the new roll of crisp, bright white paper and a bowl of sticky paste. Applying the paste to the thin wooden slats required a steady hand. Rolling the new paper over the frame and trimming the edges with a sharp blade was a work of pure craftsmanship. When the freshly papered doors were finally placed back into their tracks, the entire room suddenly felt brighter, cleaner, and full of fresh light. The smell of the wet paste and the sharp, clean scent of the new paper signified a fresh start for the household, a physical cleansing of our living space. The rhythm of the year was punctuated by the intense, joyful chaos of the local neighborhood shrine festivals. These were not massive, commercialized events. They were organized entirely by the local neighborhood associations, the very people who lived on your street. Weeks in advance, you would hear the faint, echoing practice of the traditional wooden flutes and the deep, booming strikes of the taiko drums in the evenings. On the day of the festival, the streets were closed to cars. Men, women, and children wore matching cotton festival coats, their names printed boldly on the collars. The men would hoist the incredibly heavy, ornate portable shrine onto their shoulders, chanting loudly and aggressively in perfect unison, their voices echoing off the concrete walls of the houses. The air was thick with the smell of grilled squid, sweet soy sauce, and spun sugar. You would buy a brightly colored water balloon on a fragile paper string, trying to bounce it without breaking it. We ran through the crowds in our wooden sandals, completely safe in the knowledge that every adult around us was a neighbor who knew our parents. It was a beautiful, chaotic explosion of community spirit that tied us deeply to the very ground we lived on. Finally, we come to a ritual of farewell that was perhaps the most beautiful and emotionally profound of all. Before the bullet trains became incredibly fast, and before cell phones allowed us to text, I have arrived safely. Saying goodbye at the train station was a deeply significant act. You did not just drop someone off at the curb in a car. You walked with them all the way to the platform. To do this, you had to buy a specific, cheap paper ticket called a platform ticket, which granted you permission to enter the station purely to see someone off. When the heavy steel train arrived, the person leaving would board and immediately open the glass window by their seat. You would stand on the concrete platform, right outside their window. You could hold their hands, pass them a small boxed lunch, and look directly into their eyes as the final minutes ticked away. When the long, piercing whistle blew, the train would begin to move incredibly slowly. You would walk alongside the train, your fingers touching theirs until the very last possible second. And then you would stand absolutely still on the platform, watching the back of the train get smaller and smaller, waving your hand until it completely disappeared from sight. It was a prolonged, physical dedication to the act of parting, ensuring that the last thing your loved one saw was you, standing there, wishing them a safe journey. As we open our eyes and return to the present day, it is easy to feel a profound sense of loss for these vanished moments. But perhaps we do not just miss the physical things. We do not just miss the heavy black telephones, the sweet potato trucks, or the platform tickets. What we truly miss is the way time felt. We miss the innocence of our youth and the beautiful, invisible threads that connected us so tightly to our families and our neighbors. These rituals forced us to slow down, to look each other in the eye, and to appreciate the small, quiet efforts of daily life. If this journey brought a tear to your eye or a warm smile to your face, please gently press the like button and subscribe to our channel. We will continue to preserve these beautiful fragments of history together. Now, I want to ask you, my friend, what is the one everyday ritual from your childhood that you wish you could experience just one more time? Please leave your personal story in the comments below. Let us read them, remember together, and keep the spirit of those golden days alive forever.